Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webcast, Cannabis, CBD, and Cannabinoids, What Employers and Consumers Should Know, sponsored by Aimed Alliance. This webcast has been pre-approved for HRCI and SHRM credit. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credits. If you have any questions during the webcast, click on the Q&A tab in your webinar controls and type them there. A new tab will open in your browser with the webcast survey. Please be sure to complete it as soon as the webcast is ended. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to Aimed Alliance for their presentation.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's webcast on cannabis, CBD, and cannabinoids. My name is Mike Barnes, and I'm counsel to Aimed Alliance. I'm also a principal attorney at Sequel Health Law, where I practice health and drug law and policy. Today's webinar is hosted by Aimed Alliance, a not-for-profit organization. Its mission is to protect and enhance the rights of healthcare consumers and providers. So Aimed Alliance works to ensure that people can access safe and effective healthcare treatments that are most appropriate for their individual needs. Our work also includes protecting consumers from misinformation. If you're interested in knowing who the organization's supporters are, they're listed on the website, aimedalliance.org. To give you a preview of today's program, our purpose is to help equip you to make your own informed decisions on these topics. This is intended to help you in your personal decision-making as well as in your professional capacity. So we'll discuss cannabinoid definitions, a lot of interrelated words, trying to provide clarity then, and then go into issues like FDA approval status, health and safety profiles, and ways to support employees. So additional HR-specific topics will include health insurance coverage, employee assistance programs, workplace safety, and recovery support. If you have questions, you may type them into the questions section of your screen at any time, and we'll address them when we reach the Q&A part of the agenda, which will be 5 or 10 minutes before the end of this hour. I'm honored to introduce today's other speakers. I'll be brief in summarizing their backgrounds because I've asked my colleague Olivia to paste the link to our speakers' full bios into the chat interface. Aaron Day is CEO and previously COO of Community Impact NC. That is a substance use disorder prevention and harm reduction organization. She's a recovery coach and is trained in racial equity and reducing health disparities. Aaron Weiner, PhD, is a licensed psychologist and master addiction counselor. He's board certified in counseling, psychology, and received his doctorate from the University of Illinois. He's president of the Society of Addiction Psychology. Our goal is to provide you timely and credible information to enable you to conduct your own analyses, draw your own conclusions. We want to say, each of us, on behalf of the other speakers, is we all recognize and respect the varying opinions on cannabinoid policy questions. And Aimed Alliance specifically supports efforts to remediate injustices associated with marijuana policy, many of which have been racially disparate. We also respect people who use substances, recognize substance use disorder as a treatable medical condition, and actively promote policies and programs that do not discriminate based on health status. So this leads us into the definitions. We'll start with cannabinoids. Cannabinoids are the substances found in the cannabis plant. There are more than 100 of them that have been isolated and identified. So the most common cannabinoids that you'll recognize likely are CBD, cannabidiol, and delta-9 THC, previously referred to only as THC, but now, as we'll hear from Dr. Weiner, there are a bunch of other products that are similar but distinct, and so we're also having a focus on delta-9 THC as the specific, most commonly recognized element of the cannabis plant that is responsible for the euphoric effects. Cannabis is a plant of the Cannabaceae family that includes multiple species. One of those is Cannabis sativa, and that is the plant that's grown to produce varying concentrations of cannabinoids, including THC and CBD. THC, of course, being adjusted to the level of desired euphoric effect. The terms cannabis and marijuana are often used interchangeably, especially in discussions around policy, but they actually have distinct meanings under federal law. And we're going to follow these specific definitions today because they don't have the same meaning when you say cannabis versus marijuana. Marijuana under federal law refers to the parts of the Cannabis sativa plant that contain more than 0.3% delta-9 THC. So that's a level that the federal government has deemed intoxicating and that is subject to potential misuse. So that federal definition includes the seeds, resin extracted from the plant, derivatives of the plant, and it does not include hemp. Hemp, on the other hand, is any part of the cannabis sativa plant containing 0.3% or less delta-9 THC. So that's lower THC that's deemed not to be impairing or intoxicating. So hemp is a legal product under federal law. So again, looking at cannabis, if you talk about broadly the plant, you have to then assess whether it's marijuana or hemp to determine the legality under federal law. Marijuana is illegal to manufacture, distribute, dispense, or possess marijuana under federal law. It's not been approved as a drug by the FDA and has currently no accepted medical use under federal law. It hasn't been recognized by the Food and Drug Administration as safe and effective. Nonetheless, 37 states and DC, as you all likely know, have legalized marijuana for certain therapeutic uses, and 19 states now, in addition, the District of Columbia, have enacted measures to permit and regulate adult non-therapeutic use of marijuana. So we've got that conflict between federal and state law that we'll be discussing. It'll be some context for our discussion throughout today's webinar. Hemp, as we've discussed, hemp is at 0.3% or less delta-9 THC. If it is at that level or lower, then it's legal under federal law. And then so you've got to be asking, with this conflict, is there a likelihood that in a state where the law permits under state law marijuana manufacturing, distribution, and possession, will the federal government actually enforce federal law? Well, Congress has answered that because in each year since 2014, Congress has enacted spending laws that prohibit the use of federal funds to prevent states and DC from implementing their own marijuana laws. So the risk of enforcement as it relates to activities that are consistent with state law are very low, considering this congressional dictate restriction on federal funds. CBD, again, cannabidiol, one of the cannabinoids in the cannabis plant, has been approved by the FDA in one form, and that's a medication that contains purified CBD derived from marijuana. It's Epidiolex, and that is basically the medical grade CBD. So the FDA also has approved 3 synthetic marijuana-related medications, Nabilone and 2 forms of dronabinol. And those, of course, are FDA approved and available only with a prescription. So you've got 1 natural cannabinoid medication and then 2 synthetic cannabinoid medications that have been approved by the FDA. CBD is illegal as a food ingredient or as a supplement, but we know nonetheless it's marketed in violation of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, often with unproven medical claims. And Dr. Weiner will discuss more about the marketing and claims associated with these CBD products that are not approved by the FDA and not legally on the market. CBD containing cosmetics are legal if they're safe and have 0.3% delta-9 THC or less. So this brings us on to the question of why. Why is it that there's only 1 natural and 3 synthetic cannabinoid medications approved by the FDA? We know that there are many FDA-approved natural and synthetic opioid medications, for example. So what's the difference? One main reason is that federal regulations historically impeded marijuana research. Basically, the DEA served as a very effective roadblock to medical and scientific research on marijuana. But that is changing. In fact, we had a new development under federal law as recent as last Friday. That's when the president signed the Medical Marijuana and CBD Research Expansion Act, which will expand research into cannabinoids and will likely in the future yield new FDA-approved medications. Additionally, the DEA has now approved 5 manufacturers of marijuana for research purposes. Previously, there was only 1. And so that, I think, will open up a supply for research as well. This takes us now to Dr. Weiner. Your turn.
All right, thank you. Let me just share my screen real quick, and then we will keep this party going. All right, I think we're all set. Let me know if you can't see or hear me at some point. But we are now going to launch into health risks of cannabinoids use in the workplace. I am, as was mentioned, a licensed clinical psychologist and addiction psychologist, and this is a topic that I speak on very often because there's a very clear gap between what we hear about these products and safety concerns, and then what we actually know from medical science. And so my hope is that we can bring those two things together in the 20 minutes or so that I've got with you guys today, and really try to make it so that when people ask you questions, you feel like you're coming from an educated place. So actually, to save some time, Michael has actually covered the first 3 slides, bullets on this slide. So I'm just going to blow past these definitions and go to the part where we talk about how THC works, in that it binds to what are called CB1 receptors in the brain. And if you look at where they're located, you can see why when someone's intoxicated under the influence of THC, which is the cannabinoid that gets you high, why they tend to potentially have motor control and impairment problems. There's some higher cognitive function problems because of the cerebral cortex receptor sites for cannabinoids. Appetite stimulation there in the hypothalamus. Down here in the medulla is why it does suppress vomiting, but then also some learning, memory, and stress impairment in the hippocampus. And what goes on in the spinal cord, sometimes helps with pain, sometimes doesn't. We'll talk more about that in a minute, specifically what we know about it. But the reason, as was mentioned, why THC works on you is that your brain, just like with opioids, has receptor sites where it can communicate with us. However, THC in particular does get you high, and it's actually the most used recreational substance in our country behind alcohol and tobacco, our 2 federally legal substances. There's a number of ways that you can take it into your body as well that have an impact on how it impacts you and how it might impact your work performance or safety. The classic way, if you will, to take it in is by smoking it, either in a joint or a blunt, which is kind of like a larger joint that's also wrapped in cigar paper. You could also smoke it up through water, which is how a bong works, or, and this is one of the more troubling trends, you can vape it. And the reason why I say troubling is because this is far more convenient to use marijuana concentrates, which are much, much, much stronger than the flower, which is what you're smoking up here. Previously, if you wanted to use these concentrates, you had to use the modified bong with something called a nail. That's what you're looking at here, where the concentrate is that little orange bit down there in the bottom. And then you literally would have to use a butane torch to heat it up, which is cumbersome and somewhat dangerous. And so using a vape pen makes it a lot more accessible. And again, unfortunately, and we'll talk more about this in a second, that it really highly increased potency causes a lot of problems in terms of the safety profile. But then there's also edibles, and I could throw pictures of edibles up all day. Different states have slightly different regulations on how these look like, but essentially you put the THC into an edible product, which is part of what's driving a lot of the youth poisonings and the sorts of things, because outside of the wrapper, there's no way to tell a candy with THC infused versus one that doesn't have it. So I mentioned potency, and we should definitely cover potency here. It's gone up a lot over time. Back in Woodstock and as late as the mid-90s, the average potency, that's this blue line, of THC was a little under 4%. It was about 3 to 4% for decades. But as the commercialization really started to take hold, both on the medical market and then recreational over time, you start to see essentially the THC being selectively bred stronger and stronger and stronger, and the CBD being brought down, actually, in most strains, to the point now where it's actually almost impossible to buy traditional THC products under 5%. This was a study that came out a couple of years back looking at states with legal marketplaces. The green parts of these pie charts are when it's over 15% THC. So you can see it's basically everything. And specifically states that have a medical program, the average the study found was 19.2% and recreational was 21.5%. So to put that another way, if you are in a state with a recreational program and you get an average joint, so you can go more than that as well, but it's like lighting up 7 joints from Woodstock concurrently and smoking them all at the same time. And that's one joint of today's marijuana products. It's very different. And in terms of what that does to the brain, we're seeing differences in that as well. The concentrates as well, which might also be called things like butter, wax, shatter, There's a lot of names for it. Those can quite literally be over 95% pure in some cases and are commonly 60 or 70% pure or more. So really a very different product in a lot of ways than what it used to be. THC also is a physically addictive substance. And if I had to name the #1 myth about THC that persists, it's that you're not going to get addicted to marijuana. It is actually the second most common substance that we treat in rehab programs behind alcohol in the country, in part because it's probably the second most used in terms of something that will acutely destroy your life, as opposed to, like, say, cigarettes, which is like a slow death, although also really bad. But it is physically addictive. This is a picture from my own DSM-5-TR, which is like the psychiatric Bible. We've known about this for years and years and years. It's not addictive in an instant, like some other really highly addictive drugs, like say your heroines or even sometimes your cocaines. They can grab you really quickly. Marijuana is more like alcohol, in that most people who use it don't develop an addiction, but that doesn't mean it's not addictive. There's actually a certain percentage that do. And in fact, that number right now is about 1 in 10 adults who uses it, about 1 in 8 kids, and then 25 to 50% of people who use daily. So it is something that's addictive. The THC part, again, in particular, not the CBD. We'll talk about that in just a second. But definitely something to be aware of and factor into if someone was using it for a therapeutic purpose, in terms of risks versus benefits. There are some therapeutic uses for cannabinoids. So you may have some employees saying, I have a medical card for this, I'm using it for a certain condition. We don't have enough time to really dive into all of the nuance around this, but essentially the long story short is that this is actually what the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine tells us that it's actually good for. And that's stimulating appetite, suppressing nausea, THC only, epilepsy, just CBD, spasticity. So basically, if you have multiple sclerosis, stopping your muscles from spasming, insomnia. So this has only been tested with cannabinoids, so not smoked products. So either CBD has been found to be useful for this, or very low dose. So that's probably under 5 milligrams at a time, which is very low. To put that in perspective, an average joint has about 40 milligrams of THC that you'd get from it. So low dose, 1-to-1 CBD to THC. And then there's mixed evidence for pain. And the reason why I mention that is that we've seen this mixed evidence for a long period of time. And actually, just within the last week, another study came out. This one just made national news about how essentially a large portion of the pain sparing effects in these cannabis trials that have actually been done properly can be attributed to the placebo effect. Placebos are very powerful things, but you also don't necessarily need to take anything, or in particular to get a placebo effect. So it's something where the jury is definitely still out on this. The moral of this story in particular, though, is oftentimes there are FDA-approved methods for meeting the needs of treating a certain disease or a certain symptom. And a lot of times people find themselves either into more of a self-medication place, or even working with a primary care doctor to get them approved to use marijuana or THC in some sort of therapeutic way without seeing a specialist, or because there's this idea that because it's a plant, it's not going to harm you in any way, which we know, again, is not the case in terms of this product in particular. Just another quick note. Here's another one about how the mixed evidence around cannabis and pain. And again, in this one, a 4-year longitudinal, they didn't find the results they were looking for. Just a quick note on some other areas as well, because it's not to say that you can't get some therapeutic benefit, but I think it's important that we're honest about the fact that there's a lot of areas where it's supposed to help, but doesn't. PTSD in particular is a place where for trauma, it's been said that this can help. All of our studies actually say otherwise. This one was on veterans in particular, and found that actually it pushes it in the other direction. This study, again, looking at veterans, found that it was actually bad, not only just for trauma, but for substance use problems, suicidality, and all sorts of psychiatric disorders. And I think it's important to highlight that that's because we've got this theory of why medical marijuana or medical THC products should work. And that's because we have this endogenous inside our body cannabinoid system. And the thought is, okay, so this system is involved in a lot of different diseases. Why don't we manipulate the system, hope to get something good to happen? Doesn't actually work out that way, though, in a lot of the different situations that people might use it. And again, we can go into a lot more of the specifics here, but broad strokes, that's what we're looking at. Now, CBD, interestingly enough, works very differently. Now, CBD you can find just about everywhere, from gas stations to health food stores to everywhere, because it's legal to sell under the Farm Bill. It passed in 2018. It, however, doesn't even act on cannabinoid receptors. There's limited activity in the brain and body. CB2 receptors is the cannabinoid receptor in your body versus CB1, which is more just up in your brain. It hits a lot of different systems, actually. Most notable is something called the TRPV channel, or transient receptor potential vanillinoid. That being said, essentially, it's basically just the most common thing we found is that it can be an anti-inflammatory. But it's worth mentioning that a lot of the actual research that's been done, which shockingly enough is not actually a lot, even on CBD, has been on rodents, has been on animals. And so we don't have as much on humans as you probably think that we should. That said, because it hits a lot of different systems in the body, there's been a lot of speculation about the fact that it could be used for things before the evidence is actually there. As Michael mentioned, epilepsy, something called Epidiolex, has been the only application for CBD that has met FDA standards for approval for human use. And it's worth mentioning, this is an actual medication, a pharmaceutical that you would get a prescription for and that you'd buy from a pharmacy. It is possible to take cannabinoids through the FDA process without necessarily doing an end around, which is essentially what dispensaries are doing. They're not FDA approved. We're calling them like medical, even though it hasn't actually gone through that process. But the problem with that, and the reason why it hasn't gotten through the FDA, is that there's mixed evidence for a lot of things, CBD in particular, for a lot of these different conditions, either mixed, contraindicated, yet there's a lot of claims right now that people are making that just are simply untrue or inaccurate. This was a medical review that came out this year, looking at all cannabinoids as medicinals. And again, to go quickly, because our time is limited today, I should mention I'm happy to send these studies to anyone who's interested. Please feel free to email me or reach out. But it says that CBD and other cannabinoids have potential, but we haven't actually seen it in replicated, good, solid, randomized controlled trials yet. This is a study that was actually looking at warnings from the FDA to people who are marketing CBD predominantly inappropriately, claiming that it can help things including cancer, diabetes, inflammation, pain, arthritis. There was actually a study quite literally that came out this week actually showing that CBD for pain did not work in a longitudinal study of folks in palliative care. So just a quick aside with that, this research is constantly coming up. That being said, for CBD, the thing about it is that it actually has a pretty good safety profile. You don't really have to worry too much about CBD hurting you as a substance. It's not going to get you addicted or high. It's not psychoactive in any way like that. The side effects listed for Epidiolex, which is the FDA-approved CBD medication, are diarrhea, headache, increased appetite, and sleepiness or somnolence. Also, higher rates of pneumonia in children. If children were to take it, really high doses can lead to abnormal liver function tests as well. So if you have a liver problem, probably not the best idea to like gulp down bunches of CBD. But essentially, it's not as a substance going to cause many problems. That being said, it is not approved or regulated by the FDA. And the reason why that matters is that there's a lot of problems and impurities with the products. So although CBD might not be problematic, the fact that it's not always what you think it is problematic. And a recent study in particular found that only 30 to 40% of products had the advertised amount of CBD. 20 to 50% actually contained THC. So from the employer perspective, that has some implications in terms of drug testing. Now, another element of CBD that has implications on drug testing is something called paralysis or degradation under heat. So if someone is eating CBD or consuming it in any way where you don't heat it up, it will stay as CBD as it's metabolized to the body. However, if you heat it up, it breaks down into a bunch of different things, including delta-9 THC and delta-8 THC. I believe the number is something around like 15% is converted. So if someone is vaping or smoking a CBD product, they are getting THC in their system at the same time. Low dose, but it's there. So from a drug testing perspective, we need to be aware of that. Now, how much of that plays into the fact that we've actually seen drug positivity go up in terms of just in the workforce in general, and then also post-accident. It's been going up actually for the past several years, according to Quest. Right now, it's at its highest level in 20 years. And a big driver for this has been due to marijuana and cannabinoids. 16 different industries all showed this increase, including, again, those post-accident rates. And marijuana, 17 out of 17 industries saw this. And this is not a surprise because there are businesses, commercial enterprises that are trying to grow their user base. They're advertising, here in Illinois, where we have, that's rhyme-based, we have billboards all over the highways for these places. It's meant to bring in customers, and it's working. But it is then trickling into the workplace. A couple other safety aspects of this that I want to make sure we touch on before my time's up today. I'm going to start with something that sounds really jarring, but we do have to talk about it because it's real, which has to do with psychotic breaks associated with particularly high potency cannabinoid products. This is something that we've seen go up and up and up over the years as more people are using it. And this, by the way, this is not like reefer madness. This is peer-reviewed, replicated scientific data. And one of the things that really caught my eye about this study, which came out about 2 months ago, they were looking at, does it matter if you're legalizing it in your state? Do you have more psychotic breaks due to marijuana? The answer was yes. But what actually we found here in this study was that there were 129,000 hospital discharges in 2017 due to marijuana use. That is a lot of people. That means one person every 4 minutes is having a psychotic break in this country in 2017. So that number is probably higher now. In particular, you've got to watch out for the concentrates. This study that made national news a couple of years back found that the concentrates give you a 5 times greater chance of having a psychotic break than if you were not using anything at all. And today's this high potency flower increases it by about 50%. We also know that the other main, more acute problem you've got to watch out for is something called cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. And that's what drove the 3 times increase in ER visits due to cannabis in Colorado after they legalized recreational marijuana. This is a syndrome where you basically can't stop vomiting and you have very severe abdominal pain. So you're screaming, you're vomiting all the time. It can quite literally kill you. You can vomit yourself to death. That's what happened to this particular teen, but it's extremely uncomfortable. And oftentimes people struggle to diagnose it because they think, well, doesn't THC, doesn't marijuana suppress vomiting? And the answer is yes, in most people or at lower doses, but for some people and at higher doses, it can do the opposite and cause very significant problems. Now, the other area we really need to touch on for workplace safety is driving while high, which is something if you are using all the time, either because you're trying to take it therapeutically or because you're taking it recreationally, becomes a much larger issue. This study asked people in the past 6 months, have you driven high if you're taking medical cannabis for pain? And they found that over half said yes, I've driven within 2 hours of use or while a little high. 1 in 5 said yes, I've driven while very high. And this is compared to the base rate of 4% of people would endorse that just generally in the population. So if you have employees who are using this product regularly, the chances that they are going to decide to drive while on it are a lot higher. And this is a really deceptive drug in terms of driving safety because it goes out of your blood and into your brain extraordinarily quickly, where it continues to affect you. Unlike with alcohol, where your blood alcohol content matters, and you can measure it and draw inferences from it in terms of functioning. Marijuana is attracted, THC rather, it's attracted to fat, and your brain is 70% fat. And so essentially, and that's this pink line here, this is marijuana, or rather, again, THC in the blood over time. You can see that right after smoking or vaping, it goes up and then bam, within 3 hours, it's all gone. But the performance, that's the green line, is not where it should be. And subjective high is not gone at that time either. And the slopes of those 2 lines also are not the same. And so whether or not people can judge if they're safe to drive or police officers can, it gets to be really tricky. Urine drug screens also look back a long way. So it's really tough to really determine active impairment, yet you can't through that actually. Now it does definitely impact how you drive. I'm not going to read this slide off to you. Feel free to download the slides and look at it on your own. But these are all of the cognitive related tasks that cannabis impairs. And these are the driving behaviors that have been studied. This was from a review that came out last year. So it's not just like you drive slower and safer. quote unquote, which is, I think, again, one of those myths, not how it works. It actually does contribute to a lot of motor accidents every year. Your peak impairment is within 20 to 40 minutes following inhalation. Longer for edibles. Edibles take about 2 to 3 hours to kick in because they have to sift through the food in your stomach, and your stomach doesn't have as much open surface area as all those little alveoli in your lungs that are designed to soak in oxygen. So it takes a lot longer for them to get in. But if you're smoking it or vaping it, 20 to 40 minutes, if you're using a low or moderate amount within 3 to 4 hours, you're probably okay to drive, definitely by 4.5. But it's, again, not like alcohol where you could like go to a bar, have one drink and be safe to drive afterwards, or have a couple and wait an hour or two. This is something that sticks around in you a much longer period of time. CBD does not buffer against driving impairment as well, and it's estimated to be related to about 6,800 fatalities annually. More frequent use also tends to lead to a greater chance of a motor vehicle accident. So I'm going to accelerate through these last slides because I'm taking away from the better Erin's time. She's coming right after me, so I'm going to go very quickly here. But I want to make sure that you guys are aware of this too. There are semi-synthetic derivatives of hemp and CBD as well. And so what that means is that you take CBD and hemp, which is legal, but then you run it through a chemical process to turn it into something that does get you high. Delta-8 THC is one of these things. It's legal in 29 states right now. And here is a map. You can see where you are. Within this map here in Illinois, there's no restrictions on it, so anyone at any age can buy it from anywhere, which is part of why this was actually bought from a gas station at a place here in Illinois. That's where I got that picture from. So it's something where all the regulations on how it's marketed out the window. It's not regulated in any way for the product itself as well, and there's no health and safety standards. It's used made using toxic chemicals. So you take CBD, you put it in with a bunch of chemicals, and that's how you convert it. It has serious health risks. The FDA's got a good article on this. Very quickly, though, it's not just Delta-8, which is a little bit actually less potent than regular Delta-9 THC. That's what the THC you get from marijuana is. THCO acetate is another product that's being synthesized from hemp, and the CBD from hemp. It's rumored to be 3 times as strong as THC. I say rumored because anecdotally, that's what everybody, quote unquote, is saying on YouTube and on, we'll call them the cannabis aficionado channels, but we don't have the clinical research. This is highly unknown. But then we've also got other compounds like HHC, which is supposed to be about about 80% as strong as regular Delta-9. You can actually synthesize Delta-9 THC from hemp and from CBD. That's what this is here as well. And then there's like this massive rabbit hole, again, all of which you might be able to buy at a gas station with all of these different semi-synthetic cannabinoids. This one is Delta-8, Delta-10, THCH, and THCJD. I don't even know what some of these things are. No one really does, but you can buy it and you can put it in your body, and we're still trying desperately to figure out what all this stuff actually does. So that is, as a whole, what's going on right now in the cannabinoid marketplace. You've kind of got the regular path, and then the rabbit hole goes really deep if you're getting deep into it. So to sum everything up briefly, and then I'll pass it off to Erin part 2. THC, it has acute effects on the brain, which can interfere with job performance and safety. We do have some therapeutic indications for different cannabinoids, but it's not nearly as expansive as what's been advertised. Details, please refer back to the slides for that. They've got numerous immediate and long-term risk factors for employees in the workplace, both in terms of driving impairment to addiction. We could talk about it for a long time. And again, we'll go through that quickly. Hyperemesis as well, we touched on. And then the hemp and CBD products are being altered to gain those euphoric properties, even in states where you might have some sort of regulated cannabinoid or marijuana marketplace. So thank you guys. Again, my contact's on the slide. I'm just going to move quickly through this to get over to Erin Day. So thank you guys for your time, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Okay, I think I did it. Let me know if you cannot hear me or see my slides. All right, great. I am Erin Day. Thank you for having me. I'm going to bring this down to the ground level. That was a lot of good information from Dr. Weiner and Michael. Thank you all. Thank you both. So I work for a community nonprofit, Community Impact NC, and we are a 40-year-old nonprofit organization, and we serve over 50 of our state's 100 counties. We have a staff of 6, and then we have 2 National Guard members who are 40-hour-a-week employees, but they are paid by the National Guard. And we support the building and sustaining of community coalitions to address substance misuse at the local community level. So that's what we do. I've been in the field of prevention for 15 years, and I'm an employer and I'm a recovery ally. And what that means is I've experienced loving someone with a substance use disorder, and I have access to resources, recovery support resources, and treatment resources. My first introduction to human resources was in undergrad when I did an internship at Bridgestone Americas. I don't know if anybody's on from Bridgestone. They had a giant HR department. It was really interesting. They stuck me in the filing cabinet so I could pay my dues, and I filed. So anyway, I'm happy to be able to talk with you today. So first, I'd like to get us on the same page linguistically, because I think language is important, especially when we're talking about substance use disorders. And my job, or what I was tasked with in this time together, is to help you support your employees, help you to consider your own position on substance use disorders, and specifically cannabis and marijuana. And so that's what I'm going to try to do. All right. So I wanted to bring up this slide from the National Council for Behavioral Health. There are a lot of these. You can Google it, language related to substance use disorders. Recovery language is also what it's called. Say this, not that. And I know that we've all had some sort of something like this in our professional world, where we've had to evolve in what we call things to be more inclusive, less stigmatizing, more supportive. And so I think this is an important slide. And the thing I'd like to bring to your attention are the person first language. I'd like to bring that to your attention. And then the positive drug screen versus dirty drug screen. Positive versus negative versus dirty and clean, I think, is important in your space, specifically with the HR department. I know that at Bridgestone, like I spoke about, they had their own drug testing space in their HR department, which was wild. And I'd like to also draw your attention to how to setback versus relapsed. There's also a term, return to use or recurrence of their disease versus relapsed. And then chooses to not to at this point versus non-compliant. A lot of times we'll say that someone's non-compliant, which is kind of yucky. So I just wanted to point this out. You'll have access, obviously, to this, and you can, like I said, Google it if it's of interest to you, and maybe starting this trend at your place of employment, or using this language when you speak to your family and friends. The other thing I did want to point out is with substance use disorders, sometimes to help people get their arms around substance use disorders as a disease versus a moral issue, I like to use the idea that substance use disorders have been categorized as and Dr. Weiner can probably speak to this better than me, but they've been categorized as a chronic disease, brain disease. And with that, you can liken it to something like diabetes or congestive heart failure, which are also chronic issues. And so a lot of times when someone does not maintain their chronic disease, they have a recurrence of that disease, or they have issues. So just like that, substance use disorders have to be a recovery status has to be maintained. We have to have preventive measures, just like we have preventive programs for diabetes. We have preventive programs for congestive heart failure or heart issues, same kind of thing. So sometimes that helps to kind of get your arms around looking at substance use disorders in a different light. Okay. So CBD, I'm going to talk about, and then I'll talk about marijuana a little bit. And Dr. Weiner brought this up. Can CBD use cause a person to test positive for THC? And the answer is yes. And so it's not regulated. There's no federal quality, purity, or dosing standards for non-prescription CBD containing products. Those who use it more habitually are more likely to test positive for THC. And then just the simple fact that the amounts of THC are not regulated, and as Dr. Weiner pointed out, a lot of times there are more than what's indicated on the packaging included. So if you are working for an employer who tests through hair follicles or tests through blood or urine, there's a variety of times in which that THC can stay in your system or in those pieces. Like in your hair, it can stay for a very long time versus urine or blood. We also have a document that'll appear in the chat at the end, I believe, that is kind of a Q&A document for CBD and gives some really good information for you to have at hand. I know a lot of times HR professionals like to have their cork board with their quick fact sheets. So that might be something you could put in your book. Okay, so marijuana. I do want to talk about the fact that, as Dr. Weiner and Michael said, not an FDA approved drug to treat any illness or disease. Has not endured any rigorous testing by National Institutes of Health or other drug testing bodies. So the medicine that you pick up from your pharmacy has endured those drug testing mechanisms. Marijuana has not. Physicians do not prescribe marijuana. Pharmacies do not dispense it. Contrary to popular opinion, physicians, most of the time, I don't want to say all the time, most of the time, they do a certificate that certifies the patient has a qualifying condition to receive their cannabis card. So it's not a prescription like you're used to on their RX pad that is connected to their physician ID number or their license number that gets sent to the pharmacy, et cetera. It's not like that. It's a certification that you have a qualifying condition. So I just want to point that out because a lot of people say I have a prescription for this, but that's not the accurate terminology. And if we're just kind of splitting hairs on that, just so that you can be clear, if someone were to say that to you, you can say, well, actually, you have a certification. Okay, so I also wanted to point out the fact that if adult use is legal is the only thing legal in your state or where you live, you can look at marijuana like you do alcohol. You don't get up and drink alcohol and then go to work or go out to your car during your lunch break and drink alcohol and then go back to work. So it's kind of the same thing with adult use marijuana. That would be something that you would do after work or on the weekends that you would not do in the morning and then come to work and be fit to perform your job. And then if you have it therapeutically legalized in your state, you can think of it just like a mood altering prescription. And should you take that, a lot of times mood altering prescriptions, they have a warning and they say, do not operate heavy machinery, do not do X, Y, and Z. And it's the same idea. So if you know you have to go to work, or you know that you work at Bridgestone building tires, or you know you have to drive your car, you would not want to take that therapeutic medication knowing it's going to increase your risks of injury or injuring someone else. Okay, so this is kind of referring to what I was talking about earlier. I debated on using this slide. It's not my typical, but I think it's just a good graphic of how long the marijuana can be detected in your system, because there's a lot of discrepancy. And then if you do random drug screens, if you do pre-employment, if you do regular screens, there's a lot there's a lot of questions and there's a lot of chatter amongst employees. Okay, so maybe you do use adult use marijuana, and you don't know what the policy is at your place of employment. You know, you've got a drug screen. You've probably heard that there are things that can flush out your system. Is that smart? Is that true? These are things that you might want to look into. So I know Bridgestone did hair when I was there. That was their mode of testing. So that was interesting. The first time that I'd heard of that. I've heard about it a lot since, but. Okay. Oh, also on this, I'm sorry, on this slide, I did want to say that some states say that any amount of marijuana that is detected in your system, that you are impaired. And then some have a level like we do for alcohol. So that might be something that you want to look into with your state and what that law is and what that says, especially as you begin to look at your own internal policies. So employer considerations. This has changed since the November election. So I just want to put that caveat out there. I understand that. But it's close. So I wanted to point out first, I got off the SHRM website that this little quote, which I thought was interesting, that we can expect to see the courts continuing to protect the rights of the users, the marijuana users, not the employers. So you need to think about that when you begin to think about your internal policies and what that might mean to you and what that means to, well, we'll talk about that later, but you might want to think about that. Okay, so I guess, okay, I'll be quick. If you sit on your Chamber of Commerce or are a member of your Chamber of Commerce, I think that's important. And so we're talking about employer considerations, important to be connected to your Chamber of Commerce. I was on our board of our Chamber of Commerce, and so every time we had a board meeting, we would sit around and they would say, what's happening with your industry or at your in your position. So I would always say, first, it's not an FDA approved medication. And everybody would be like, what? Inevitably, one person would say, what do you mean? And I'd say, it's not gone through all the testing that your other prescriptions have gone through. And they'd say, oh, I didn't know that. The other thing I'd say is look at your policies, look at them now, take a preemptive look at them if your state has not already legalized in any way. And then the last thing I'd say is, especially if your state sells adult use marijuana products like the gummy bears that Dr. Weiner showed, I would say, just to kind of bring it back around, I'd say, if you have access to THC gummies, only eat the arm. And that was my way of saying that the packaging and the labeling can be misleading, and you may not know what the serving size is, and you eat the whole gummy bear and you're slithering on the floor or having a psychotic episode like Dr. Weiner referred to, because you didn't realize. Of course, that would make them laugh and we'd get back to whatever, but it's important. So, and I say the Chamber of Commerce link because that is a place where you can see what other industries and other companies are doing, if anything. So that's that link. Okay, so policy considerations. What does your current policy say? Okay, what does it say about safety? What does it say about access to clean air, or how do you feel about that as a company? Do you have a smoke-free, vape-free policy? Does that include marijuana? Do you have a drug testing policy? I assume most of you do. What does that look like? Does that look like if anything is identified, then you're impaired, or are you going to have a level, or are you going to say, you know, how are you going to go about that? Also, if they have a medical certification, how will you look at that? Okay, what do you produce? So safety wise, and this goes back to my Bridgestone example. If you're producing tires, you need to be acutely aware of any impairment of the employees that work within your organization. And then based on what else you might produce, how well are your employees able to do their job if they're impaired? Is marijuana legal in your state? What does the law say regarding employer rights? So if you have someone who can look into law, that would be helpful. And then if not, that's you can reach out to maybe one of us. Okay, and then what does this mean for health insurance costs and coverages? Right now, health insurance is not looking to cover this, to cover marijuana as a treatment until it is meets accepted standards of medicine. And so there's that. What does this mean for your company culture? And what does it mean for your publicly perceived image? Those things are important to think about. And then what can be done now? So this is a list of just easy things that you can do. Make sure everybody's on the same page. Make sure that you update your policy. Make sure you, and then the last thing I would say is space and flexibility for people to attend mutual aid meetings, AA, NA, if that's something that they need. That's support, that's easy, something easy that can be done to be supportive. Right, and these are why I do what I do, my daughter and my son. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Day. So now that we recognize that there are some employees who are using marijuana and other substances, having looked at the positivity rates, for example, we know that there's things that employers must do, as Ms. Day just explained. And so there's also the element of education. Education is especially important now in light of substance use and the market, the illicit market that includes fentanyl and other adulterated products, like, for example, counterfeit medications. So broadly, education on the risks of substance use, the opportunities for interventions, treatment, and recovery support is an important role that the employer can fulfill. Obviously, avoid the stigmatizing actions, stigmatizing policies and language. And so that includes making sure, as a matter of policy, you have quality health insurance that includes mental health and substance use disorder benefits in parity with medical surgical benefits. They should be similar coverage as between mental health, substance use disorder, and medical surgical. Coverage of FDA-approved medications, and you think, of course, well, that's much of what AIM Alliance does on a daily basis, is address the problems where medications are not being covered by insurance companies, especially medications for rare conditions. Those typically have high prices because there are fewer patients to pay for the products. Voluntary compliance with the Affordable Care Act's patient protections, such as essential health benefits. And that brings me to remind you that there is another AIM Alliance webinar that's coming up on December 13th. And that's about essential health benefits, importation of drugs, and other health insurance related topics, December 13th at 11 a.m. That's also a freehr.com webinar. Employers can provide appropriate medical leave, short and long-term disability coverage for people if they need to help a family member, if they themselves need to pursue treatment or recovery. A robust employee assistance program, and then knowledge among employees that is available to them as a resource for interventions, for treatment access, and other sorts of supports. And then a robust recovery community within your workplace as well. So that includes affinity groups, flexible scheduling for mutual support meetings, as Ms. Day said, and then possibly even occasional substance-free events. So I also have listed some resources here. We've got legislative proposals that are actually trying to require coverage of non-FDA approved cannabinoid products. And so these resources address that topic. Obviously, ensuring adequate employee access to medications in healthcare broadly is difficult enough. I think many HR professionals fret a lot over how to provide quality health insurance and other benefits at an affordable cost. It's expensive. But mandatory coverage of non-FDA approved cannabinoid products would create new costs for products that, as we heard, have not yet been adequately proven to yield therapeutic benefits. And that's largely because of the restrictions on research up to date. That's changing. Coverage mandates would create significant legal issues for the employers as well, including possible non-compliance with the Affordable Care Act and other federal laws, and then potential liability for negligence associated with the acts of impaired employees. So again, more resources are available in these documents, which should be pasted into the chat box. We've got a long one, a medium one, and a short one. So the long one is likely more of interest to attorneys in your workplaces. The medium one is about 8 pages. It's a fact sheet for health plan decision makers. That's you. And then the short one expressly discusses insurance coverage mandates, and that's only 2 pages. I also would recommend a toolkit that was created for opioid-related workplace considerations, but it's applicable to all substance-related concerns in the workplace. It's from 2017. It's still up to date and still relevant. From Kentuckiana Health, this is an employer toolkit that has some interesting discussions around substances in the workplace, benefit design, obviously of relevance to HR professionals, workplace policies, and other legal considerations and resources. So here is my contact information as well. All 3 of the speakers, thank you for attention, and you can feel free to contact any of us, connect with us, follow us using email, LinkedIn, Twitter. It is now time for Q&A. Olivia, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. I'll pull the questions now. First question is what is the significance of the 0.3% Delta 9 THC?
Aaron, how about you go on that one? Aaron with an A. Dr. Wayne.
Yeah. No, so 0.3% THC is very, very low. And that's why that was the cutoff between what we classify as hemp and what we classify as THC. So in terms of someone actually like eating like hemp hearts or anything like that, you don't have to be concerned about all of the safety aspects that I spoke about in my presentation from that. The real concern around CBD products, again, is that they're not being regulated. So are they pure? Or again, it can convert into THC if you're vaping it or if you're smoking it.
Yeah, I mean, up as recently as basically a couple of weeks ago when Congress passed additional marijuana-related legislation, they kept that 0.3% THC the same. So clearly Congress believes that that's the point at which intoxication or impairment would occur. And therefore, that's the point at which above that 0.3% product would be currently illegal under federal law. Any other questions, Olivia?
Yes. How long does THC or CBD stay in your system for purposes of testing?
Ms. Tate had a good slide on that.
Yeah.
Aaron, do you want to talk about that?
Sure.
Or refer back to your slide, possibly?
Yes. Can I
It
steal
looks
this?
like, it could be as short as hours, right, for blood testing, and then longer for urine testing, and then even longer for hair testing. There you
Right.
go.
And this will be available, so you can download it and print it off.
And the next is how can you tell if the THC is from a CBD product or versus marijuana?
That's a good question. I think that might be like a paper trail thing, because I think chemically is the same thing. So it would have more to do with, it reminds me of the time when people went to tobacco-free nicotine in vapes, which is true. You can make nicotine in a lab, but they used that to evade the FDA for a little while longer. Where it comes from, I think, and then maybe there's some chemical trace in there somewhere, but I think it has more to do with just examining manufacturing processes.
And the next is any suggestions on training for management?
I would say from a legal perspective, you want to work with your legal counsel and have a good policy in place first before you do training. Obviously, you want to know what the federal law is, and that's changing quickly. Stay up to date on that, and then know what the state law is, know how the state law has been interpreted in the courts and what the rights of employers are, as Ms. Day said, versus the rights of employees. Put together a thorough, robust policy that addresses a lot of the topics related to safety in the workplace, and then impairment while on duty, and other sorts of questions like driving. The topics, really, we tried to spot some issues for you today during this webinar. And once you've got that policy, you use that policy to train the management as well as the employees, including, as I discussed, We want to train employees on the broad risks of substance use, especially in the light of the illicit market that has counterfeit and other substances that are adulterated with very, very potent fentanyl that is driving our poisoning crisis. I think that's all the time that we have, actually. We want to thank you again and remind you that we have an AIM Alliance webinar on December 13th at 11 a.m. That's on essential health benefits, importation, and other health insurance topics. So once again, thank you for your attention. Thanks to the speakers, and we hope you all have a productive afternoon.
Take care, everybody. Be well.
Thanks.